I never intended to become the quiet, complicit architect of someone else's nightmare, but loneliness has a devastating way of making you entirely blind to the blood on your own hands. My name is Arthur. I am 59 years old, and I left everything I knew in Chicago to find peace in Mexico, only to realize I had unwittingly financed a cartel. It all started the way the most profound tragedies usually do, not with a dramatic choice between good and evil, but with a desperate, exhausting desire to simply stop waking up alone in a cold house. For over 30 years, I worked as a restoration carpenter in the freezing, wind-battered neighborhoods of Chicago, spending my days breathing life back into cracked mahogany staircases and rotting Victorian window frames. I was a man who understood how to fix broken things, how to sand away the damage of time and apply enough pressure and care to make something structurally sound again. But while I was out saving century-old houses from the wrecking ball, my own life had quietly hollowed out from the inside. The winters felt longer every single year, the cold settling deep into the joints of my hands, and the silence in my apartment had become something heavy, something physical that sat on my chest while I tried to sleep. I was financially secure, having saved nearly every dollar I earned, but I was spiritually bankrupt and terrified of dying unnoticed in the city that buried its dead under 3 feet of snow. That was when I bought a one-way ticket to Guanajuato City, a place I had only seen in magazines, drawn by the promise of eternal spring and the challenge of restoring a colonial stone house perched high on one of its dizzying, colorful alleyways. I thought I was buying a sanctuary, a vibrant, sun-drenched final chapter where I could work with my hands until my body gave out, surrounded by church bells and cobblestones instead of ice and asphalt. The house I purchased was a beautiful crumbling ruin on a steep hill overlooking the city center, and it was during the early days of sweeping out decades of dust that Ximena walked into my life. She was managing a local hardware and material supply store down in the valley. And the first time I went in to source reclaimed timber and authentic iron fixtures, she spoke to me with a warmth that felt like a physical shock to my system. Ximena was a decade younger than me, impossibly vibrant, deeply rooted in her community, and she possessed this effortless grace that made my rigid, solitary American habits feel instantly obsolete. She started helping me translate complex orders for materials, which quickly turned into her bringing me coffee on my job site, which then melted seamlessly into long, lingering dinners in the lively plazas of Guanajuato. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly seen, not as a reliable worker or a quiet neighbor, but as a man who still had vitality, who still had something valuable to offer the world. I was intoxicated by the way she looked at me, by the way her massive, sprawling, extended family seemed to welcome me into their chaotic Sunday gatherings without question. I convinced myself that I had finally beaten the system, that I had outrun the miserable, solitary fate that was waiting for me in Chicago. So when Ximena came to me one evening with tears in her eyes, explaining that her older brother needed a substantial loan to keep his regional transportation and logistics company afloat after a bad season, I did not hesitate to write the check. I told myself it was an investment in my new family, a simple gesture of goodwill from a man who had more money than he could spend in a lifetime to the people who had given him a reason to live. It is staggering how quickly a small compromise can metastasize into an entire alternate reality, when you are terrified of losing the one thing keeping you tethered to the earth. The first loan for the transport company was followed by another request a few months later to purchase a fleet of heavy-duty vehicles, and then a sudden urgent need for cash to secure a warehouse facility on the outskirts of the state. Every time I handed over the money, I felt a sickening twist in my gut. A quiet, rational voice from my past life warning me that something was deeply wrong with the mathematics of her brother's business. But whenever I thought about saying no, whenever I pictured drawing a hard line in the sand, I was immediately paralyzed by the image of Ximena packing her things, walking out the heavy wooden doors of my restored colonial house, and leaving me alone with the silence again. I was buying her presents, financing my own illusion of a happy retirement, and because I had spent my entire career fixing structural rot, I arrogantly believed I could manage the decay in my own home. I ignored the fact that her brother never actually signed any paperwork. I looked past the strange, aggressive men who started dropping off materials at my house in the middle of the night, and I deliberately chose not to ask why Ximena suddenly had a brand new luxury SUV that cost more than the store she supposedly managed. I was funding an entire operation out of my life savings, draining the accounts I had built over 30 years of breathing in sawdust and freezing on scaffolding, simply because the alternative was facing the fact that I was an old, foolish man who had mistaken a transaction for a romance. The willful blindness shattered on that Tuesday afternoon when I came home early from the lumber yard to find 3 men I had never seen before sitting in my living room, counting massive stacks of foreign currency on the very mahogany dining table I had built with my own hands. Ximena was standing in the corner, her face completely devoid of the warmth and affection I had mortgaged my future to keep, and she did not even blink when I walked through the door. One of the men, a young guy with cold, dead eyes and a heavy firearm resting casually on his lap, thanked me for my continued investments in their supply chain, explaining with a chilling politeness that my Queen American money had been instrumental in expanding their northern routes. In that singular, suffocating moment, the entire puzzle clicked together with a violence that made my knees give out. I had not been saving a family business. I had been systematically laundering my own retirement funds to purchase armored vehicles, secure stash houses, and facilitate the movement of narcotics across the border. Ximena had never been my partner. She was a scout, a beautiful, calculated operative whose sole job was to identify lonely, wealthy expatriates who were desperate enough for affection that they would not ask questions when the bank transfer started. When I looked into her eyes, searching for any trace of the woman I thought I loved, I saw absolutely nothing but the cold calculus of someone waiting for a useful tool to finally break. They did not threaten to kill me that afternoon. They simply informed me that I was now an integral part of their financial structure, and that if I ever tried to stop the flow of money, or if I ever went to the authorities, they knew exactly where my sister lived back in Chicago. I left Guanajuato City 3 hours later with nothing but my passport, the clothes on my back, and a terror so profound it felt like I was swallowing glass with every breath. I abandoned the beautiful stone house I had painstakingly restored. I abandoned the antique tools I had carried with me for decades, and I abandoned every single cent I had left in those local accounts, fleeing toward the border in the dead of night like a hunted animal. Today, I am living in a small, rented room in a city I will not name, working odd jobs for cash because my formal retirement was entirely liquidated to fund the very violence that tears this continent apart. I spend my days looking over my shoulder, jumping at the sound of heavy footsteps, and wrestling with a guilt that is so heavy it makes it difficult to stand up straight. I thought I was moving to Mexico to escape the cold, to find a beautiful, vibrant end to a life of hard labor. But I learned the most brutal lesson a man can learn about the vulnerability of the human heart. When you are starved for connection, when you are utterly terrified of facing your own mortality in an empty room, you will eagerly hand the keys to your life over to monsters, just as long as they promise to hold your hand while they destroy you. I survived my retirement, but I lost my soul in the transaction, and I am left with the agonizing knowledge that my desperate need to be loved ended up paying for the bullets that shattered other people's lives. People always assume that a trap snaps shut the moment you step into it. But the most devastating traps are the ones that are slowly and meticulously built around you while you are comfortably asleep inside them. Looking back at my first few months in Guanajuato City, I can see the architecture of my own ruin with an agonizing clarity, but at the time, I honestly believed I was constructing a paradise. The house I had purchased was a massive, sprawling colonial structure made of thick stone and heavy timber, tucked into the steep, winding alleyways where the sounds of the city echoed like a chaotic symphony of street vendors, barking dogs, and distant church bells. I spent 12 hours a day covered in a thick layer of plaster dust and sawdust, tearing out rotted floorboards and stripping decades of cheap paint off beautiful original cedar doors. It was exhausting, bone-aching work for a man approaching 60, but it was a magnificent distraction from the hollow ache in my chest that had followed me all the way from Chicago. I believed that if I could just make this house beautiful again, if I could just restore its structural integrity, I would somehow magically restore my own. But physical labor only keeps the mind occupied until the sun goes down, and when the evening inevitably arrived, the silence of those massive, empty stone rooms was absolutely deafening. I was a stranger in a vibrant, tightly knit culture, isolated by my own clumsy, broken Spanish and my deep-seated American habit of keeping to myself. I was terribly, desperately lonely, and that loneliness was a beacon broadcasting my vulnerability to anyone who knew exactly what to look for. Ximena knew exactly what to look for. She did not approach me with grand romantic gestures or the heavy-handed seduction you might expect from a younger woman targeting an older expatriate. Her brilliance lay entirely in her subtlety, in the way she positioned herself, not as a lover, but as an absolutely indispensable ally in a world I did not understand. It started with the materials for the house. I was struggling to navigate the local markets, constantly overpaying for inferior hardware, and entirely incapable of negotiating with the local tradesman who saw my foreign face as an open wallet. As Ximena began stepping in to mediate, using her sharp, commanding Spanish to secure fair prices for copper plumbing and authentic ironwork, saving me thousands of dollars and countless hours of frustration. She portrayed herself as a fiercely loyal protector of my interests. A hard-working woman who despised seeing a good, honest man taken advantage of by opportunistic locals. I was completely disarmed by her supposed integrity. I began relying on her to translate not just my business transactions, but my daily life, bringing her along to the bank, the municipal offices for building permits, and eventually to the small, dimly lit restaurants scattered around the city center. When you surrender your voice to someone else, when you allow another person to become the sole filter between you and the outside world, you are handing them the absolute control over your reality. I did not realize she was isolating me. I honestly thought she was holding my hand. The transition from a professional reliance to an intimate dependency was so seamless, I barely registered the shift until it was entirely too late. Ximena began arriving at the house unprompted, bringing warm tortillas, roasted peppers, and homemade stews in cheap plastic containers, insisting that a man working as hard as I was needed someone to ensure he was actually eating. We would sit on the dusty, half-finished staircase of my ruined mansion, sharing a meal, while the sun set over the colorful, crowded valley below, and she would ask me questions about my life in Chicago that no one had asked me in decades. She listened with an intense, unwavering focus, validating every grievance I had about my past, reflecting my own quiet sorrow back to me with a manufactured empathy that felt like a warm blanket on a freezing night. I poured out 30 years of solitary confinement, telling her about the cold winters, the failed relationships, the terrifying fear of growing old and becoming entirely invisible. She absorbed it all, and in return, she began feeding me carefully curated stories about her own life, painting a picture of a resilient, deeply traditional woman burdened by the heavy responsibility of caring for a sprawling, struggling family. She told me about her older brother, a man who supposedly ran a heavy agricultural land clearing operation down in the valleys, clearing brush for massive agave plantations. She described him as a proud, desperate man, constantly fighting off predatory lenders and corrupt local officials just to keep his workers paid and his family fed. It was a masterful performance, perfectly calibrated to appeal to my deeply ingrained working-class American savior complex. The introduction to her family was the final fatal turn of the lock. One Sunday, she invited me to a massive family gathering at a modest concrete house on the dusty outskirts of the city, plunging me into a chaotic, overwhelmingly warm environment filled with loud music, running children, and endless plates of food. I was seated at the head of the table, treated not as a wealthy foreign outsider, but as an honored guest, a wise and respected elder whose presence was a blessing to their home. For a man who had spent the last 20 years eating dinner alone in a silent apartment, the intoxicating warmth of that table was the most potent narcotic on earth. Her brother Hector poured me expensive tequila and listened to my stories about carpentry with a reverent, respectful attention that made me feel like a king holding court. I was profoundly, desperately addicted to the feeling of belonging to them, to the illusion that I had finally found a tribe that valued me for my wisdom and my presence. I was completely blind to the calculating glances exchanged across the table, oblivious to the fact that I was not a patriarch, but a remarkably cooperative mark being fattened up for the slaughter. When Ximena came to me weeks later, weeping softly in the dark of my bedroom, explaining that Hector's agricultural machinery was going to be repossessed by corrupt creditors, and the entire family would be ruined, the decision had already been made in my heart long before my brain could process the risk. I did not write that first massive check because I believed in his business. I wrote it because I was absolutely terrified that if I didn't, the music would stop, the table would be cleared, and I would be thrown back into the crushing, unbearable silence of my own life. The first wire transfer felt like dropping a heavy stone down a bottomless well, waiting in the suffocating silence for a splash that never actually came. I remember walking out of the local bank branch just off the Jardin de la Union, the bright, unforgiving Guanajuato sun blinding me as I clutched the flimsy carbon copy of the international receipt in my calloused hands. $50,000. It was a staggering amount of money, a significant bleeding chunk of the financial security I had meticulously accumulated over 3 decades of breathing in toxic varnishes and shattering my knees on hardwood floors back in Chicago. But when I handed that slip of paper to Ximena later that evening, the way she threw her arms around my neck, the way she wept softly into my shoulder and called me the savior of her family, it made me feel like I had just purchased an impenetrable fortress against my own obsolescence. I returned to my restoration work the next morning with a renewed, almost manic energy, desperate to prove to myself that I was now a patriarch, a crucial, load-bearing pillar holding up an entire family structure. I spent my days meticulously sanding down the massive antique cedar doors of my colonial home, treating the old wood with expensive oils to protect it from the elements, completely and tragically oblivious to the fact that I was actively dismantling the protective walls around my own life. The irony is bitter and suffocating to me now, but at the time I felt an immense intoxicating pride because I genuinely believed I was building a legacy. I was no longer just the quiet, solitary American carpenter fading into the background of a foreign city. I was Hector's silent partner, the benevolent benefactor of an honest agricultural enterprise, and most importantly, I was the man Ximena looked at with absolute, unwavering reverence. But the devastating nature of a transaction disguised as love is that the price of admission will inevitably, relentlessly continue to go up. The profound gratitude that followed that initial $50,000 lasted exactly 3 months before the next catastrophic, entirely unforeseen emergency miraculously materialized out of thin air. This time, Hector came to my house personally, sitting at the half-finished mahogany dining table I was building, his face a perfect, tragic mask of exhausted desperation. He spoke rapidly and intensely in Spanish, while Ximena translated with a trembling voice, explaining that a sudden, corrupt shift in municipal zoning laws meant his heavy land-clearing equipment was going to be permanently impounded unless he could immediately secure a massive, incredibly expensive parcel of private warehouse space outside the city limits. The mathematics of the situation did not make sense to me. The urgency felt entirely manufactured, and the cold, rational voice of the Chicago tradesman buried deep inside my head screamed that honest businesses simply do not operate in a constant, panic state of life or death, financial ruin. But sitting across from them, smelling the faint, intoxicating scent of Ximena's perfume, and watching the way Hector respectfully deferred to my judgment as the elder of the house, that rational voice was violently drowned out by the terrifying prospect of the alternative. If I looked him in the eye and said no, I would instantly transform from their generous savior into the wealthy, stingy foreigner who callously let their family collapse. The warmth would vanish, the chaotic, beautiful Sunday dinners would end, and the massive stone house I was restoring would suddenly become a silent, echoing tomb again. So, I nodded solemnly, projecting an air of masculine control that I absolutely did not possess, and I authorized the second wire transfer, telling myself it was simply the cost of doing business in a developing country, while the truth was that I was simply paying the ransom for my own companionship. As the months bled into a year, the financial bleeding became a routine, normalized part of my existence, and the subtle, chilling transformations in my environment began to manifest right in front of my eyes. Ximena no longer arrived at my dusty job site carrying warm homemade stews in cheap plastic containers. Instead, she began pulling up the steep cobblestone alleyway in a brand new, aggressively tinted luxury SUV that was entirely incongruous with the modest salary of a local hardware store manager. Her simple, woven clothing was rapidly replaced by expensive designer brands, and the delicate silver jewelry she used to wear was swapped for heavy, ostentatious gold pieces that cut the light when she moved. When I finally gathered the courage to gently ask about the sudden, inexplicable influx of wealth, she smiled the perfectly calibrated, entirely hollow smile and explained that her brother's agricultural business was finally booming thanks to my generous investments, and that he was simply taking care of the family that had stood by him. I desperately needed to believe her, so I forced myself to swallow the rising metallic taste of nausea in my throat and accepted the lie without further question. But her behavior was fundamentally changing too, as the warm, attentive woman who had once spent hours listening to my stories about the bitter Chicago winters began to grow distant, impatient, and remarkably controlling. She subtly and systematically discouraged me from interacting with the other American expatriates in the city, insisting that they were superficial tourists who would never understand the deep, authentic Mexican life we were building together. She became the absolute, uncontested gatekeeper of my reality, ensuring that my Spanish never progressed beyond basic pleasantries so that I would remain entirely dependent on her to navigate the world outside my heavy front doors, effectively trapping me in a beautifully restored, sun-drenched prison of my own making. The most terrifying part of this entire ordeal was not the sudden, violent realization of what I had done, but the agonizingly slow, deliberate process of choosing to ignore the monsters that were gathering right in my own living room. The supposed agricultural business I was funding required endless infusions of capital for what Nzamena translated as transportation logistics and securing rural routes, vague corporate terminology that I willingly accepted without ever once demanding to see a ledger, a tractor, or a single acre of cleared land. Then the late-night visits began to shatter the peace of my carefully curated retirement. I would be lying awake in the cavernous master bedroom, the heavy cedar shutters closed against the chill of the high-altitude air, when I would hear the distinct, heavy crunch of large tires on the cobblestones right outside my window. I would peek through the wooden slats and see men who did not have the calloused hands or the sun-baked skin of agricultural workers standing in the deep shadows of the alleyway, speaking in hushed, urgent tones with Hector. They wore tactical boots, carried heavy, unidentifiable canvas bags, and moved with the distinct, predatory hyper-vigilance of people who operate entirely outside the boundaries of the law. Sometimes they would come inside, using my restored living room to count thick, banded stacks of American currency, while I remained frozen upstairs in the dark, pretending to be asleep, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I knew deep down in the darkest, most cowardly corner of my soul, I knew exactly what kind of dark harvest my retirement funds were actually reaping in those rural routes. But I was 59 years old, 1,000 miles away from the only life I had ever known, and I was so paralyzed by the fear of being alone, so fundamentally terrified of admitting that my final chance at happiness was a grotesque criminal lie, that I simply closed my eyes, pulled the blankets up to my chin, and allowed the nightmare to continue. I spent my entire career in Chicago identifying rot hidden behind beautiful plaster facades, knowing exactly by the subtle sag of a floorboard or the faint smell of damp earth when a load-bearing beam was fatally compromised and a structure was fundamentally unsound. Yet, when it came to the architecture of my own survival in Guanajuato City, I willfully ignored the massive splintering cracks spreading across the foundation of my daily life, choosing instead to paint over the rapid decay with desperate, pathetic rationalizations because the truth was simply too terrifying to accommodate. The human mind is a remarkably resilient and deeply cowardly instrument, capable of building elaborate, impenetrable fortresses of denial just to protect the fragile ego of an aging man who could not bear the humiliation of his own gullibility. I convinced myself that the heavily armed men visiting my home in the dead of night were private security contractors hired to protect Hector's legitimate agricultural assets in a dangerous region, and I forced myself to believe that the massive, untraceable cash withdrawals were simply the chaotic reality of doing business in a cash-heavy rural economy. I was meticulously sanding the beautiful, reclaimed wood of my colonial dream house, while the absolute worst elements of the Mexican underworld were actively using my bank accounts to build a heavily fortified empire of violence and extortion right under my nose. I walked around the vibrant, sunlit plazas of the city, greeting the local merchants with my broken Spanish, entirely unaware that I had become the quiet, compliant American bankroll for the very people systematically destroying the safety of the community I claimed to love. The rot had spread into the deepest corners of my sanctuary, and I was the one who had happily handed over the keys, unlocked the heavy wooden doors, and invited the termites inside to feast on my life savings. The fragile, meticulously constructed illusion of my peaceful retirement finally and violently shattered on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when a delayed shipment of imported brass hardware forced me to leave the lumber yard in the valley several hours earlier than my usual routine. I walked up the steep, winding cobblestone alleyway toward my home, the high-altitude sun beating down on my shoulders, feeling a strange, hollow knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach that I tried to dismiss as simple exhaustion. When I pushed open the massive cedar front doors, expecting to find the cool, quiet sanctuary of my unfinished living room, I was instead hit by the harsh, metallic smell of gun oil and the low, tense murmur of unfamiliar voices echoing off the plaster walls. There were three men I had never seen before sitting casually around the spectacular handcrafted mahogany dining table I had spent 3 months building, and stacked between them were literal mountains of banded foreign currency and heavily taped bricks of what I instantly, sickeningly recognized as narcotics. My breath caught in my throat like a jagged piece of glass as I stood paralyzed in the entryway, my eyes frantically darting from the high-caliber automatic weapons resting casually on my antique chairs to the thick, calloused hands of the men rapidly sorting the catastrophic harvest of my financial investments. In that singular, suffocating moment, the desperate fog of my denial evaporated with a blinding, agonizing clarity, revealing the grotesque reality that I had not been saving a struggling family business, but rather serving as the primary, unwitting financier for a regional cartel cell's aggressive northern expansion. The staggering weight of my own foolishness crashed down on my chest, pinning me to the floorboards as I stared at the physical, undeniable proof that my overwhelming fear of dying alone had transformed me into a major logistical asset for a violent criminal enterprise. But the most devastating blow did not come from the sight of the weapons or the drugs. It came from the corner of the room where Iximena was standing, her arms crossed over her chest, watching me with an expression of such absolute chilling indifference that it made my blood run entirely cold. This was the woman who had wept into my shoulder, who had held my calloused hands across candlelit tables, who had convinced me with a terrifyingly perfect emotional precision that I was the deeply respected patriarch of her vibrant, loving family. Now looking into her dark eyes, I searched frantically for any trace of the warmth, the vulnerability, or the affection I had mortgaged my entire future to protect. But there was absolutely nothing there except the cold, hard calculus of a highly effective operative observing a compromised tool. She did not flinch, she did not offer a frantic explanation, and she did not try to shield me from the heavily armed men sitting at my table. She simply stared at me with the bored, slightly irritated expression of someone dealing with a minor administrative inconvenience. The psychological violence of that moment was infinitely worse than any physical beating I could have endured, because it completely erased the last 3 years of my life, reducing every intimate conversation, every shared meal, and every single moment of profound connection into a calculated, entirely fabricated transaction. Ximena had never been my partner. She was an exceptionally talented scout, whose sole professional responsibility was to identify wealthy, emotionally isolated expatriates wandering through Guanajuato City, manipulate their desperate need for human connection, and smoothly redirect their life savings into the cartel's incredibly sophisticated money laundering apparatus. I realized with a sickening, dizzying horror that the sprawling, chaotic family dinners I had so desperately craved were nothing more than elaborate theatrical productions, staged entirely for my benefit, designed to keep the stupid, lonely American feeling important, while they systematically drained his bank accounts dry. The silence in the room stretched out into an unbearable, suffocating eternity until one of the men at the table, a young guy with cold, dead eyes and an expensive watch, slowly stood up and walked toward me with the chilling, exaggerated politeness that made my stomach aggressively heave. He did not yell. He did not press the barrel of a gun to my head. He simply smiled a razor-thin smile and thanked me in perfect, unaccented English for my continued, highly valued investments in the rapidly expanding supply chain. He explained with the calm and methodical tone of a corporate accountant delivering a quarterly report that my clean American money had been absolutely instrumental in purchasing armored transport vehicles, bribing municipal officials, and securing vital stash houses along the heavily contested northern routes. He told me that they considered me a vital, irreplaceable partner in their organization, and that they fully expected the regular, substantial wire transfers to continue without any sudden interruptions or unexpected changes in my banking habits. When I finally found the breath to quietly whisper that my retirement accounts were nearly completely empty, that I had nothing left to give them. The young man's smile did not waver even a fraction of an inch, as he gently placed his hand on my shoulder. He leaned in close, the smell of expensive cologne and peppermint radiating off his skin, and softly informed me that if the money ever stopped flowing, or if I ever entertained the remarkably foolish idea of speaking to the local authorities or the American consulate, they knew exactly where my younger sister lived in her quiet suburban neighborhood back in Chicago. He recited her full name, her exact home address, and the make and model of the car she drove to work every morning, delivering the information with a casual, terrifying precision that completely and permanently shattered whatever microscopic fragments of courage I had left in my body. How do you pack up a 30-year life in a beautifully constructed 3-year dream when you only have 10 minutes before the illusion completely collapses and buries you alive? The honest answer is that you do not pack anything at all. You simply wait until the heavy oak doors close behind them, until the distinct rumble of their luxury SUV fades into the labyrinth of cobblestone streets, and then you quietly walk out of your own life forever. I stood frozen in the entryway of the spectacular half-finished colonial mansion for what felt like hours, listening to the agonizingly profound silence that had settled over the stone walls, a silence that felt infinitely heavier and more dangerous than the loneliness I had originally fled in Chicago. I walked slowly into the living room and ran my trembling hand over the smooth, oiled surface of the mahogany dining table I had built, feeling the microscopic grooves where my tools had shaped the wood, violently aware that this beautiful piece of furniture had just been used to organize the destruction of human lives. I took nothing but my blue American passport from the hidden safe in the floorboards, a handful of crumpled pesos from my nightstand, and the dusty work clothes I was already wearing, intentionally leaving behind the antique restoration tools I had carried since my early 20s. I abandoned the magnificent cedar doors I had painstakingly sanded, the gleaming copper fixtures I had proudly installed, and the entire breathtaking fantasy of my sun-drenched Mexican retirement, stepping out into the cool evening air like a ghost haunting its own grave. I navigated the steep, winding alleyways of Guanajuato City in the dead of night, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, every elongated shadow looking like a man with a rifle, every distant dog bark sounding like a coordinated pursuit. I did not stop walking until I reached the chaotic, brightly lit bus station at the very edge of the valley, purchasing a one-way ticket for the first departure heading north, sitting completely paralyzed in the back row of a rattling diesel bus as it pulled away from the only place I had ever truly felt alive. The journey north was a grueling, hallucinatory blur of endless desert highways and exhaust fumes, a physical transition that perfectly mirrored the terrifying psychological descent I was actively experiencing. I watched the sun rise over the rugged mountains of central Mexico, the beautiful golden light violently illuminating the staggering, catastrophic wreckage of my own making, forcing me to confront the absolute totality of my foolishness. I knew with a chilling, undeniable certainty that I could never go back to my old life in Chicago, utterly terrified that my presence, or even a simple phone call, would draw the cartel's incredibly well-funded violence directly to my younger sister's quiet suburban doorstep. By the time I stepped off that bus in the dusty, transient border city that I will never publicly name, I had been entirely stripped of my identity, my dignity, my financial future, and the fundamental right to exist safely in the world. Today, I am approaching my 60th birthday, living in a single, windowless rented room that smells perpetually of damp concrete, industrial bleach, and stale cooking oil, surviving day to day by doing off-the-books, grueling carpentry work for exploitive landlords who do not ask questions about where a broken American came from. My hands still ache with the familiar biting arthritis I originally brought with me from the frozen Midwest, but now my chest aches with a profound, suffocating shame that makes it incredibly difficult to look at my own reflection in the cracked mirror above my sink. I spend my evenings sitting alone on a plastic milk crate in the dark, listening to the muffled, chaotic sounds of the street traffic outside, endlessly replaying those vibrant, intoxicating Sunday dinners in my mind, trying to pinpoint the exact fatal moment I willingly traded my common sense for a fleeting, manufactured illusion of warmth. I want you to listen to me very carefully right now, especially if you are approaching the quiet twilight of your own life and you find yourself staring at the walls of an empty house, desperately wishing for someone to simply acknowledge your existence. The world is absolutely full of incredibly dangerous, highly observant people who specialize in identifying the quiet, hollow spaces inside a lonely heart, and they will gladly build a beautiful, comforting fantasy around you just to harvest whatever financial resources you have left to give. They will not come at you with obvious threats or demanding ultimatums. They will come at you with warm homemade meals, attentive listening, and the intoxicating promise that you are still valuable, still needed, and still capable of being loved. I thought I was buying a vibrant second act in a Mexican paradise, a final chance to be a respected patriarch, but I learned the most devastating, unforgiving lesson a man can possibly learn about the brutal economics of human vulnerability. When you're entirely consumed by the fear of growing old alone, when you are desperate enough to ignore the glaring red flags just to keep a beautiful woman sitting across the table from you, you will gladly hand the keys to your entire life over to monsters. You will fund their operations, you will protect their secrets, and you will even thank them for the profound privilege of their company. Right up until the exact moment they lock you in the dark, steal your future, and walk away without ever looking back. I survived my perfect retirement, but I am serving a life sentence in a prison of my own construction. And I share this not to garner your sympathy, but to beg you to protect your peace. Because the only thing worse than dying alone is paying for the privilege of your own destruction.